I knew the HOA was petty, but this was next-level insanity. I stepped out onto my driveway early that morning, coffee in hand, expecting another normal day. Instead, I found my garage door defaced with massive, blood-red letters spelling out "violation" across the entire surface. The paint dripped down like a crime scene, staining the beige panels. My stomach dropped. My first thought, vandalism, some punk kids maybe, but then I spotted her. Miriam Langley, the HOA president and self-appointed dictator of our neighborhood, stood across the street in her ridiculous floral blouse, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. Her lips curled into that ever-present expression of disapproval, the same one she wore when she once scolded a neighbor for having a garden gnome. I locked eyes with her. "Are you kidding me?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Olivia, you were given multiple warnings about your garage door being an unauthorized color. We had no choice but to mark it as a violation." I blinked. "You spray-painted my garage door instead of just sending another letter," Miriam shrugged. "The HOA board voted on this. We needed to make an example." My blood boiled. My garage had been the same shade of off-white since I moved in 5 years ago. There was no unauthorized color issue. This was pure intimidation. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Miriam, you just vandalized my property. That's a crime," she chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, Olivia, don't be dramatic. It's just paint. If you comply with HOA regulations and repaint it the approved shade, this won't be a problem." I stared at her, barely able to process the audacity. The absolute nerve of this woman. Fine. If she wanted a fight, she'd get one. I pulled out my phone, snapped pictures of the damage, and then turned to Miriam. "Hope your board has deep pockets because you're paying for this, and more." Her smirk faltered just a little. "Well, good luck proving anything, dear." I didn't need luck. I had everything I needed. I kept my expression unreadable as Miriam turned on her heel and strutted back to her house. But my mind was already working. She thought she had the upper hand, that I would just roll over and comply like so many others had. But she had made a fatal mistake. She got bold, reckless, and most importantly, careless. I checked my security camera footage the moment I stepped inside. The high-definition feed confirmed what I already suspected. Miriam herself, under the cover of darkness, had been the one to deface my garage. She and 2 other HOA board members, both dressed in dark clothes and carrying paint rollers, had arrived just after midnight. They worked quickly, slapping on the massive red letters in under 10 minutes before scurrying back into the night like a trio of raccoons caught rummaging through trash. It was laughable how sloppy they had been. None of them even wore gloves, meaning they left plenty of evidence behind. I saved the footage to multiple devices, then printed several high-resolution stills. Next, I pulled up my HOA's bylaws and scanned through them. Nowhere did it say they had the right to deface private property for a supposed violation. In fact, their own rules stated that all infractions had to be handled through official notices and fines, not vigilante street art. Then came the real fun. I placed a call to my lawyer, David, who happened to specialize in property law. He was more than happy to take the case, especially after reviewing the footage. He laughed, a deep, satisfied laugh, and told me we had them dead to rights. "Not only is this vandalism, but it's also destruction of property and harassment," he said. "They're going to regret this." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Within the hour, I had a formal complaint filed with the local police department. As soon as I handed over the footage, the officer at the desk let out a low whistle. "They really did this?" he asked. "Yep. They're in for a rude awakening." I couldn't have agreed more. By late afternoon, word had already begun spreading. The HOA board had no idea what was coming, but my neighbors had caught wind of the situation. Some were outraged, others were simply tired of Miriam's antics. A few even stopped by to offer their support, shaking their heads at my garage in disbelief. "She's finally gone too far," said Mr. Patel from next door. I always knew she was power-hungry, but this is criminal, I nodded. Literally. Then, just as expected, Miriam showed up again. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Two of her lackeys from the HOA board trailed behind her, their faces tight with forced neutrality. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I heard you called the police," she said, her voice clipped. "That's completely unnecessary. We could have handled this like adults." I kept my tone even. "Adults don't commit vandalism in the middle of the night." Her expression twitched, but she quickly recovered. "The board acted within its rights. You were given multiple warnings," I cut her off. "I checked the bylaws. Nowhere does it say you're allowed to deface personal property. In fact, it explicitly states that all violations must be handled through written notices or fines. What you did was illegal." One of the board members, a man named Greg, shifted uncomfortably. Miriam, however, refused to back down. "If you cooperate, we can drop this whole thing," she said, her voice taking on an almost condescending tone. "Just repaint the garage and we'll forget this ever happened." I almost laughed. "Oh, I'm not repainting anything. You are, after I take you to court for damages." For the first time, genuine uncertainty flickered across her face. "Court!" I pulled out my phone and played the footage. The color drained from her face as she watched herself, and her accomplices rolling paint onto my garage, completely oblivious to the camera catching every second. "This is evidence," I said, my voice firm, "and it's going to cost you." Greg muttered something under his breath, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. The other board member, Lisa, took a small step backward. Miriam, however, puffed up like a cornered animal. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. I smiled. "Oh, I already did." Right on cue, a police car rolled down the street. Miriam's composure finally cracked as the officer stepped out and approached us. I crossed my arms and watched the panic set in. Now, it was her turn to scramble for control. The police officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, approached the group. His badge gleamed under the afternoon sun as he took in the scene: my defaced garage, the 3 HOA board members standing stiffly, and me with my arms crossed, waiting for justice to unfold. Miriam tried to regain her composure, straightening her shoulders and adopting the same authoritative tone she used to bully homeowners. She addressed the officer with forced calm, explaining that this was merely an enforcement action and that the HOA had the right to mark violations however they saw fit. The officer listened, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to me. I handed him the printed stills from my security footage, along with a flash drive containing the full video. He studied the images, his mouth pressing into a tight line. After a moment, he exhaled sharply and turned back to Miriam. His voice was firm, professional. He informed her and the others that vandalism was a criminal offense, regardless of their reasoning. The law did not grant them special privileges to deface private property under any circumstances. Miriam's confidence wavered. She sputtered something about legal authority, about how the HOA had jurisdiction over property aesthetics, but the officer shut that down immediately. He explained that HOA governance did not override city and state laws. Greg, the board member who had looked uncomfortable earlier, took a slow step away from Miriam, as if finally realizing just how deep they were in trouble. Lisa, the third member, remained rigid, though her eyes flickered with uncertainty. Then came the best part. The officer informed them that, given the evidence, charges could be pressed. He asked me directly if I wanted to move forward with filing a formal criminal complaint. I didn't hesitate. I said yes. Miriam's face drained of color. She turned to me, her voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. She suggested that we could resolve this internally without getting authorities involved. I shook my head. That ship had sailed. The officer pulled out his notepad and asked them a series of questions. Miriam's responses grew more clipped and defensive with each passing second. Greg barely spoke, while Lisa only provided vague answers, clearly trying to distance herself from responsibility. Then, the officer informed them that they would need to provide statements at the station. He didn't slap cuffs on them, but the implication was clear this was serious. Miriam's face twisted in frustration, but she had no choice but to comply. As the officer walked them to his car, she shot me a venomous glare. I simply watched, unbothered. With Miriam and her cohorts occupied, I turned my attention to the damage itself. My garage door was ruined. The red paint had seeped into the material, making it clear that a simple repainting wouldn't fix it. I called a professional contractor, who came out within the hour to assess the damage. His verdict: the entire door would need to be replaced. Perfect. I had already discussed with my lawyer the possibility of filing a civil suit, and this sealed it. The cost of the new garage door, the labor, and the emotional distress, this had caused me all added up. David, my lawyer, was confident that not only could we win, but we could also push for punitive damages given the HOA's blatant abuse of power. While I was on the phone with David, more neighbors trickled over. They had already been whispering amongst themselves, but now that Miriam was out of sight, they were far more vocal about their frustrations. Mrs. Thompson from down the street recounted how Miriam had once fined her for having excessively bright holiday lights. Mr. Patel shared his own grievances about how she had tried to bully him into removing the small vegetable garden in his backyard. Each story painted the same picture: Miriam had ruled the HOA like a tyrant for years, and finally, someone was standing up to her. By the next morning, the news had spread through the entire neighborhood. Several homeowners who had been intimidated by the HOA before were now emboldened. A petition began circulating, calling for Miriam and her board members to be removed from their positions. Meanwhile, my lawyer wasted no time. He filed the civil suit against the HOA and the individual board members responsible. The amount we were seeking: $50,000 in damages. When Miriam finally reappeared, she did so with a forced air of control, but it was clear she was unraveling. The HOA board called for an emergency meeting, likely in an attempt to mitigate the situation, but it was too late. The lawsuit had already been filed, and the growing discontent among homeowners meant her support was crumbling by the hour. A few days later, I received a letter and official notice from the HOA's legal representative. They were offering a settlement. They wanted this to go away quietly. I took the letter straight to David. We reviewed the terms, and after some negotiation, they agreed to pay the full $50,000. They also agreed to cover the cost of my new garage door and issue a formal apology. But that wasn't enough. I made sure the settlement included a clause stating that Miriam and the other involved board members had to resign immediately. They had abused their positions, and they had to face the consequences. The moment the news broke, the neighborhood erupted in celebration. Homeowners who had been too afraid to speak out before now openly discussed their own grievances, demanding further reforms. As for Miriam, she disappeared from public view, likely too humiliated to face the very people she had tried to control. The HOA tried to salvage its reputation, but the damage had been done. The remaining board members scrambled to distance themselves from Miriam's actions, and a new election was held for leadership positions. For the first time in years, the community felt like a community again. And my new garage door, it looked perfect, standing as a reminder that no one, not even a power-hungry HOA, was above the law. The neighborhood's shift was immediate. With Miriam and her cronies out of power, there was a collective sigh of relief. People who had once been too fearful to speak against the HOA now openly shared their stories. Some had been fined for absurd infractions, like leaving a hose uncoiled on their lawn or parking too close to their own driveways. Others revealed how Miriam had manipulated board decisions to serve her own interests, often rewriting policies without proper votes. The new leadership, elected in the wake of the scandal, wasted no time in undoing the damage. One of the first orders of business was a complete audit of the HOA's finances. A few of the newly elected board members had backgrounds in accounting and law, and they were eager to dig into the records. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Miriam had been siphoning HOA funds to cover her own personal expenses. Lavish dinners, spa treatments, and even a vacation to the Caribbean had all been charged under vague, miscellaneous expenses. It was outright embezzlement, and the more they uncovered, the worse it got. The board had no choice but to escalate the matter to law enforcement. When word of this new revelation spread, the residents were livid. Some had suspected corruption, but no one had imagined the scale of it. The HOA had been collecting increased dues for years, citing necessary maintenance that never seemed to materialize. Meanwhile, Miriam had been living comfortably off the hard-earned money of the homeowners she had tormented. With the lawsuit already settled, there was no stopping the additional legal consequences. The new HOA board worked with the authorities, handing over every piece of evidence they had gathered. It wasn't long before Miriam was facing criminal charges. As all of this unfolded, I finally had my new garage door installed. Watching the workers replace the defaced panels was a satisfying experience, a final nail in the coffin of the ordeal. I had made my point. No one, not even a power-drunk HOA president, was above the law. The aftermath of Miriam's downfall continued to ripple through the community. The new board members implemented sweeping policy changes to prevent another abuse of power. Homeowners were now given a say in every major decision, and the process for handling violations became transparent and fair. Fines were no longer issued for trivial matters, and any changes to regulations required a full community vote. The best part, people started enjoying their homes again. Where once there had been an oppressive atmosphere, now there was a sense of unity. Neighbors who had never spoken before now gathered for barbecues and block parties. The rigid, fear-driven control of the past had been replaced with actual community spirit. As for Miriam, her house went up for sale within weeks. She had no choice but to leave. Between the lawsuit settlement, the criminal charges, and the utter collapse of her reputation, there was nothing left for her here. No one mourned her departure. The day the moving truck pulled away from her driveway, a group of us stood outside, watching in silence. There was no celebration, no jeering. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a dark chapter had finally closed. With Miriam gone and the HOA reformed, life in the neighborhood took on a new normal. People no longer lived in fear of ridiculous fines or arbitrary rules. Instead, we looked out for each other, ensuring that no one would ever abuse power like that again. And me. I enjoyed my home in peace, knowing that I had stood my ground and won. With Miriam gone and the HOA under new leadership, the neighborhood finally began to heal. The changes were immediate. No more arbitrary fines, no more unannounced inspections, and most importantly, no more fear of ridiculous power plays. People walked their dogs without worrying about whether their leash was HOA compliant. Kids played in their front yards without the looming threat of a citation for excessive noise. The difference was night and day. But while the community embraced the newfound freedom, I wasn't done just yet. There was still the matter of how deep Miriam's corruption ran. The financial audit had exposed a fraction of her misdeeds, but I had a feeling there was more to uncover. And I wasn't the only one. A few of the newer board members, particularly a retired accountant named Linda and a local business owner named Marcus, had been digging through old records. What they found made Miriam's personal spending spree look like the tip of the iceberg. For years, HOA dues had been increasing under the justification of necessary maintenance projects. But Linda Cross referenced those expenses with actual work orders and found that most of the supposed repairs had never been completed. The funds had simply vanished. Marcus, who had experience in property management, reviewed vendor contracts, and discovered several companies that had supposedly been paid for work, but had no record of ever stepping foot in the neighborhood. The implications were alarming. Miriam hadn't just been using HOA funds for personal luxuries, she had orchestrated an entire scheme to funnel money into non-existent projects. This wasn't just embezzlement, it was full-scale fraud. With this new evidence, the board contacted a real estate attorney for guidance. The situation was far beyond simple financial mismanagement now. There were legal ramifications that could extend to the contractors who had allegedly been paid for services. If these companies were complicit, there was a chance this could turn into a criminal investigation far bigger than anyone had anticipated. The homeowners were furious when the findings were presented at the next community meeting. What had once been quiet frustration turned into outright calls for legal action. People who had dutifully paid their HOA dues for years now demanded answers. Where had their money gone? What repairs had been neglected? And most importantly, who else had been involved? The board had no choice but to escalate the matter. They hired a forensic accountant to conduct a deep dive into the HOA's financial history. The results were even worse than expected. Over the course of 6 years, nearly $200,000 had been siphoned out of the HOA's accounts. Some of it had gone directly to Miriam, but a significant portion had been funneled through shell companies that existed only on paper. It was clear she hadn't acted alone. One name kept appearing in the records: Gerald Whitaker. He had been listed as a contractor for multiple projects, yet no one in the neighborhood had ever seen him. When Marcus ran a background check, he found that Whitaker was a former business associate of Miriam's ex-husband. The pieces were falling into place. The board turned everything over to law enforcement, and soon, an official investigation was launched. Homeowners who had been hesitant to get involved before now provided statements, detailing years of unexplained fee increases and ignored repair requests. The authorities reviewed the forensic accountant's findings and confirmed what we already knew: this was fraud on a massive scale. A few weeks later, Miriam was arrested. The charges were staggering: embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Gerald Whitaker was also implicated, and authorities were working to track down other possible accomplices. The neighborhood buzzed with the news. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA were now emboldened, knowing they had been right to question where their money was going. People who had been forced to pay fines for trivial infractions now saw just how much of their money had been stolen. With Miriam officially out of the picture, the HOA board took further steps to ensure this could never happen again. They implemented strict financial oversight policies, requiring multiple board members to approve any expenditures. An independent auditor was hired to review HOA finances annually, and any major financial decisions now required a full community vote. Meanwhile, my personal battle was finally over. My garage door stood as a symbol of what had started this entire fight, a blatant abuse of power that had ultimately led to the unraveling of years of corruption. The lawsuit settlement had more than covered my damages, but the real victory was in seeing justice served. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now gathered openly, no longer afraid of being targeted for speaking out. People who had been afraid to paint their doors a different color or install a flower bed without approval were now free to actually enjoy their homes. The HOA, once a tool for control, had become what it was always meant to be: a system to support the community, not oppress it. One evening, as I sat on my porch, Marcus and Linda stopped by. They had just finished reviewing the final audit results, and the numbers were staggering. In total, Miriam and her associates had stolen nearly $250,000 from the community. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was outright criminal. But the most satisfying part: the state was pursuing full restitution. Miriam wouldn't just face jail time, she would be forced to repay every single cent she had stolen. As we talked, other neighbors wandered over, joining the conversation. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to discuss HOA matters openly. There was no fear of retaliation, no concern about unjust fines. Just a community coming together, stronger than before. Marcus grinned as he shared one last piece of news: Gerald Whittaker had been arrested as well. The authorities had traced fraudulent transactions back to him, proving he had been an active participant in the scheme. The case was airtight, and there was no way either of them would walk away from this unscathed. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sunset over the neighborhood. This fight had started with a can of spray paint, but it had become so much more. It had exposed corruption, brought a community together, and ensured that no one would ever abuse their power like that again. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood finally felt like home. With Miriam behind bars and the HOA under new leadership, things were finally starting to settle. The neighborhood had transformed from a place of quiet frustration into a true community. Homeowners who had once kept their heads down now spoke freely, no longer fearing unjust fines or secret rule changes. People took walks without side eyeing their lawns, and backyard projects flourished without the threat of bureaucratic interference. But while the neighborhood had moved on, I still had one last thing to take care of. The settlement money had arrived in my account, a satisfying final victory over the ordeal. $50,000 was nothing to scoff at, but I wasn't about to let it sit untouched. This money had come from a battle against corruption, and I wanted it to mean something. So I called up the new HOA president, Linda, and proposed an idea. The neighborhood had suffered under Miriam's reign for years. People had been forced to pay ridiculous fees, endure arbitrary rule changes, and live under the constant threat of retaliation. It was time to give something back. A week later, the community gathered in the park for a special meeting. Unlike the tense, hostile gatherings of the past, this one was filled with genuine excitement. Marcus, the board member who had helped expose the financial fraud, stood beside Linda as they addressed the crowd. I stepped forward and told them my plan. I was using a portion of my settlement money to fund a community restoration project. The funds would go toward fixing long-neglected issues: the broken park benches, the faded neighborhood signs, even the potholes that had been ignored under Miriam's rule. The rest would be set aside to create a legal defense fund for homeowners, ensuring that no HOA board could ever strong-arm residents into compliance again. The reaction was immediate. People clapped, some even cheered. For the first time in years, the HOA was doing something that actually benefited the community instead of exploiting it. Over the next month, work crews came in to repaint the signs, repair the playground, and repave the worst of the roads. Neighbors volunteered to help, eager to reclaim their space. The atmosphere was completely different now. People laughed, shared meals, and worked together in a way that had been impossible under Miriam's rule. One afternoon, as I stood watching the final touches being put on the newly repaired park benches, Marcus joined me. He had a clipboard in hand, checking off completed projects. He told me that the new board had implemented a full transparency policy. Every HOA financial decision would now be published openly, and no rule changes could be made without a full community vote. The days of secret power plays were over. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. We talked for a while, watching the last of the volunteers wrap up their work. Marcus mentioned that the legal case against Miriam was progressing quickly. With all the evidence stacked against her, a conviction was almost certain. The real question was how much time she'd serve. As we spoke, a group of kids ran by, laughing as they raced toward the newly repainted playground. Their parents sat nearby, chatting without a care in the world. It was a stark contrast to the neighborhood of just a few months ago, where even minor infractions could lead to threats and fines. The neighborhood had finally healed. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal, or rather, a new and improved version of normal. Without Miriam's oppressive rule, people started making small changes they had always wanted but had never dared to attempt. Homes got fresh coats of paint in colors that actually reflected the owners' personalities. Gardens flourished, no longer subject to arbitrary restrictions. And me. I finally felt at peace in my own home. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Linda walked up the driveway. She had just come from an HOA board meeting and wanted to share the latest update. The legal fund I had helped establish was already being put to good use. A homeowner who had been unfairly fined under Miriam's administration was now getting their money back, thanks to the new board's efforts. More people were coming forward with claims, and the HOA was working to rectify past wrongs. It was the perfect ending. As Linda left, I took one last look at my garage door, the new one, free of vandalism, standing as a monument to everything that had happened. Miriam had tried to use fear and intimidation to control this neighborhood. She had thought she was untouchable. But in the end, the community had fought back, and we had won.